I want you to picture a scene for a second. Imagine you are at the gym
Okay.
and you're just watching two people doing the exact same really grueling strength workout side by side.
Like a heavy leg day or something.
Yeah, exactly. Heavy compound lifts. And one of them is, say, a 55-year-old, and right next to them is an 85-year-old.
Quite an age gap.
Huge gap. But they are both lifting heavy, they are both pushing their limits, and they are both clearly straining under the load.
Right.
Now, based on, standard clinical assumptions about aging and exertion, you would probably expect the older adult to be visibly struggling a lot more.
Oh, absolutely. You'd assume their heart rate is just spiking aggressively just to maintain the required cardiac output.
Exactly. You'd think the 85-year-old system is redlining right out of the gate. But internally, their cardiovascular system is actually playing a completely different, surprisingly stealthy game.
It really is.
So welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore this fascinating biological mystery about how our cardiovascular system adapts as we age.
It's a great topic.
It is. We are pulling our insights today from an article by Troy Teixeira. It was published on his Substack, Ageless Gains, and it focuses heavily on the heart rate patterns of older adults during intense strength training.
And it honestly completely reframes how we interpret cardiovascular strain in aging populations.
It really does, because the way Troy frames this in his article, he grounds the data in a very relatable real-world observation.
Yeah, something he actually saw himself.
Right. He noticed this phenomenon while he was personally training his 85-year-old dad. So Troy's 55, and his dad is 85.
The exact scenario you just painted.
Exactly. And Troy observed this glaring discrepancy in their telemetry. Like, when Troy gets under a heavy lift early in a workout and he really strains
Heart rate spikes instantly.
instantly, it's an immediate steep climb into the hundreds. But when his 85-year-old dad strains just as hard on a heavy set early in the session,
Nothing happens.
basically nothing. His heart rate barely registers the exertion. Troy noted that his dad's heart rate might just, creep from the low 70s into the 80s, even during maximal effort.
Which is wild to think about.
It's crazy. It's like the dad's cardiovascular system is casually strolling while the musculoskeletal system is absolutely sprinting. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because there is some really complex physiological signaling happening here. Why does the middle-aged heart immediately jump while the older heart appears to just remain blunted during the exact same initial stimulus?
Well, to understand that, we have to look directly at the reactivity of the sympathetic nervous system, and specifically the sensitivity of the beta-adrenergic receptors in the heart.
Okay, the sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight or flight response, right?
Exactly. In younger and middle-aged adults, so someone who is 55, that sympathetic response is highly reactive.
Hair trigger.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
The moment the mechanoreceptors and metaboreceptors in your muscles sense heavy strain,
Like pushing a heavy sled?
right, the brain initiates this rapid release of catecholamines, specifically adrenaline and noradrenaline.
So it's an immediate chemical dump.
Completely. And because the beta receptors in a 55-year-old heart are still relatively dense and highly sensitive, that chemical signal translates instantly into a faster heart rate.
Got it. The system just aggressively ramps up the beats per minute to deliver oxygenated blood.
What's fascinating here is how the aging cardiovascular system shifts its entire hemodynamic strategy.
Because the 85-year-old isn't getting that spike.
Right. In an older adult, the sympathetic nervous system becomes a lot less acutely reactive. Those beta-adrenergic receptors on the heart muscle, they lose sensitivity over time.
So even if there is an adrenaline signal, the heart is kind of deaf to it.
It just doesn't respond as quickly or as sharply to sudden exertion. So to compensate for not being able to rapidly increase the heart rate, the older body leans heavily on two different mechanisms to maintain cardiac output:
Which are?
increasing systemic blood pressure and maximizing stroke volume.
Okay, stroke volume. Let's push on that mechanical shift for a second, because if we think of it in terms of, like, mechanical output for a car engine.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, so the younger heart is relying heavily on RPMs, rapidly spinning the engine faster to meet the demand. But the older heart is shifting to a strategy built on torque.
Yes. Torque versus RPMs. That is an apt way to visualize the hemodynamic shift.
It's an inotropic approach, right?
Right.
Prioritizing the sheer muscular force and the volume of each individual contraction rather than the speed of the contractions.
Exactly. Instead of frantically beating faster, the aging cardiovascular system pumps a larger volume of blood. That's the stroke volume. It pumps more blood with each steady, measured beat.
while simultaneously increasing the peripheral vascular resistance.
Right. The older adult is still generating the necessary cardiac output to fuel those firing muscles, but the system is just operating in a heavier gear.
Which makes sense.
It is a highly efficient adaptation for an engine that can no longer safely or reliably rev to its maximum RPM instantly.
That structural adaptation is impressive, but it does raise a question about sustainability.
How so?
Well, relying on stroke volume and increased peripheral resistance early in a workout, that places a significant shear stress on the arterial walls, right?
It definitely does.
And the source material highlights a major plot twist here that indicates this torque strategy has its limits. Troy noticed that his dad's heart rate doesn't just stay in the low 80s forever.
Right, it eventually moves.
By the end of the session, the 85-year-old's heart rate eventually climbs well into the hundreds. So here's where it gets really interesting.
Because the strategy shifts again.
Yeah. Because if the heart successfully manages the early workload via stroke volume and blood pressure, what physiological cascade forces the system to finally abandon that strategy and drive the heart rate up later in the session?
Well, it isn't a single switch being flipped. We're really looking at a compounding effect of 4 distinct physiological stressors, and they stack up as the duration of the workout extends.
Okay, 4 factors. What's the first one?
The first primary driver Troy's article identifies is cardiovascular drift.
Cardiovascular drift. Given that older adults inherently have lower total body water and less sensitive osmoreceptors, cardiovascular drift must set in a lot faster, right?
Oh, significantly faster.
And it must have a more pronounced impact than it would in a younger athlete. So how is the older, stiffer vascular system handling that fluid shift?
It handles it by being forced to increase the heart rate, because cardiovascular drift is driven by thermoregulation and fluid loss.
Sweating, basically.
Right. As the core temperature rises during the workout, blood is shunted to the skin to dissipate heat. Simultaneously, even mild sweating reduces your blood plasma volume.
Because you're literally losing water from your blood.
Exactly. And when plasma volume drops, the venous return to the heart decreases, which directly compromises that stroke volume we just talked about.
Ah, because there's literally less fluid available to pump with each beat.
You nailed it. Since the heart can no longer pump as much blood per beat due to the reduced fluid volume, it has to progressively increase the heart rate to maintain the same overall cardiac output.
That makes total sense. And older adults have reduced vascular compliance anyway.
Right. Their arteries are stiffer. They can't vasoconstrict or vasodilate as efficiently to manipulate pressure.
So they lose their leverage.
Exactly. When stroke volume drops due to plasma loss, a stiffer vascular system has almost no choice but to rely on an increased heart rate to keep the blood flowing to the working muscles.
Wow. Okay, so that fluid dynamic alone would be enough to cause a steady upward trend in the heart rate monitor.
Definitely, but it's not working alone.
Right, because this drift is happening concurrently with a major shift in their neuroendocrine response. Which brings us to the second factor, delayed sympathetic activation.
Yes, the slow drip of adrenaline.
We established earlier that the 85-year-old's sympathetic nervous system doesn't have that hair-trigger adrenaline release. So how long does that delay typically last? And what finally breaches the threshold to trigger the release?
The kinetics of catecholamine release change significantly with age. It isn't that the older nervous system is incapable of producing an adrenaline surge.
It's just stubborn.
It just requires a much higher, more sustained accumulation of physical stress to trigger it. So it is a slow, gradual accumulation rather than a sudden acute flood.
Okay, so a drip instead of a flood.
Right. Throughout the first 20 or 30 minutes of the workout, the physical stress is building up. Eventually, that accumulated stress crosses the higher threshold of the aging sympathetic nervous system.
And boom.
Well, finally, yes. The floodgates finally open. The adrenaline levels in the blood rise significantly, and that chemical signal finally forces the heart rate to climb into the hundreds.
So the system is essentially pacing itself. It's withholding the neuroendocrine spike until the accumulated mechanical stress truly demands it.
Exactly. It's a conservation strategy.
That is brilliant. And that ties directly into the third factor compounding this late workout climb, which is the localized metabolic demand from muscle fatigue.
Yes, tired muscles change the math completely.
If we look at motor unit recruitment, how does the fatigue of specific muscle fibers translate to a systemic increase in cardiovascular demand?
It all comes down to mechanical efficiency and oxygen extraction. Early in the workout, your muscles are fresh.
Right.
They recruit motor units efficiently, and they generate force with very minimal metabolic waste. But as the session drags on, the primary muscle fibers fatigue.
They get tired, they run out of gas.
Exactly. To sustain the exact same physical output, say lifting a 40-pound dumbbell, the nervous system has to recruit secondary, often less efficient muscle fibers to assist.
Yeah, so you're calling in the bench warmers.
Perfect analogy. Furthermore, tired muscles become slightly hypoxic. They demand a higher oxygen extraction ratio just to perform the same baseline movement.
Wow. So a compound movement at minute 40 inherently costs more ATP and therefore more oxygen than that exact same movement at minute 5.
Exactly. The sheer metabolic cost of the work increases simply because the tissue is fatigued.
And the heart has to pay that bill.
Precisely the mechanism at play. The muscles are signaling for a higher volume of oxygenated blood to compensate for their dropping mechanical efficiency.
And the heart is already dealing with reduced plasma volume from the drift.
Right, and an increasing wash of delayed adrenaline. So it is forced to elevate its rate to meet that amplified localized demand.
Which is just a perfect storm.
It is. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: vagal withdrawal, or the reduced influence of the parasympathetic nervous system.
Okay, the parasympathetic nervous system. If the sympathetic nervous system is driving the acceleration, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is governed largely by the vagus nerve, acts as the biological braking system.
Exactly, it's the brakes.
In a younger athlete, vagal withdrawal happens almost instantly at the onset of exercise to allow the heart rate to spike.
The brakes come off immediately.
Right. So is the aging system maintaining that vagal tone much longer into the workout?
It maintains a surprisingly strong influence early on. During those initial heavy sets, while the 85-year-old's heart rate is hovering in the 80s, the parasympathetic tone is still actively suppressing the pacemaker cells in the heart.
So the brakes are literally still being applied while they lift.
Yes, but parasympathetic dominance cannot be sustained indefinitely under heavy physical load.
System gotta give.
Right. As the core temperature spikes, as the plasma volume drops, as the adrenaline finally begins to saturate the receptors, and as those fatigued muscles scream for more oxygen, that vagal tone gradually diminishes.
The biological brakes slowly release.
Exactly. It is the combination of the brakes coming off and the delayed accelerator finally being pressed that allows the older adult's heart rate to reach its peak in the latter half of the training session.
Man, looking at this entire compounding cascade, you have the fluid loss of cardiovascular drift, the delayed surge of catecholamines, the increased metabolic cost of fatigued tissue, and the gradual withdrawal of vagal tone.
It's a lot happening at once.
It's a brilliant orchestration of physiology. But for someone reviewing these telemetry metrics, seeing an 85-year-old's heart rate slowly climbing into the hundreds alongside dropping vascular compliance and dehydration, I mean, that sounds clinically intimidating.
It sounds scary, yeah.
It sounds like a system approaching failure. So what does this all mean? Should a practitioner be alarmed when an older client exhibits this delayed late-session cardiovascular spike?
Actually, it is the opposite of alarming. It is a profound indicator of resilience,
Really?
provided we look at the correct metric. The most critical data point Troy observed wasn't the peak heart rate at the end of the workout. It was the recovery kinetic between the sets.
The recovery kinetic, meaning how fast it drops.
Exactly. Even late in the session, when the dad's heart rate was hitting the hundreds during exertion, it would rapidly drop back down into the 70s during the rest periods.
Wow. That rapid deceleration is the ultimate indicator of autonomic flexibility.
It truly is.
It means the moment the mechanical load is removed, the parasympathetic nervous system is capable of instant vagal reactivation.
The brakes still work perfectly.
Exactly. The biological brakes haven't failed at all. They're just being applied strategically.
That autonomic flexibility is the hallmark of a healthy, functioning cardiovascular system, regardless of age.
Because if it was failing, you'd see something else entirely.
Exactly. If the heart were truly failing or unable to handle the strain, you would see sustained tachycardia.
The heart rate would just stay high.
The heart rate would remain elevated long after the set ended, because the sympathetic nervous system would be trapped in a state of overdrive, unable to clear the catecholamines or reestablish parasympathetic control.
That makes a ton of sense. The fact that the 85-year-old system can push into the hundreds and immediately recover to baseline proves that this delayed climb is a managed, deliberate pacing strategy.
Right. It is not a systemic decompensation.
It's controlled.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, This physiological pattern dictates exactly how practitioners and trainers need to monitor older adults during intensive exercise.
Because while this adaptability is incredibly impressive, it is still an aging system under heavy peripheral resistance.
You can't ignore the risks.
You cannot simply ignore the telemetry. The source outlines several critical guardrails that must be in place to ensure this late workout climb remains within a healthy physiological window.
Absolutely essential to keep those guardrails.
So what are the key clinical markers that a trainer or a physical therapist needs to track?
First and foremost, you track that recovery kinetic we just analyzed. If an older adult's heart rate spikes and refuses to come back down during a standard rest interval,
Say, after 2 minutes, it's still at 110.
right, that points to compromised autonomic flexibility or potential cardiovascular insufficiency. And the session needs to be modified or halted completely.
Good to know. What else?
Secondly, establishing a consistent baseline is paramount. If an individual historically exhibits this delayed heart rate climb and then suddenly presents with an immediate, massive chronotropic spike early in a workout.
Like they suddenly respond like a 55-year-old.
Exactly. That acute deviation from their established pattern warrants immediate medical investigation.
Because something structural or chemical might have changed.
Right. It is about identifying their specific neuroendocrine signature and watching for sudden deviations.
But telemetry alone doesn't provide the full clinical picture, does it? The subjective physical symptoms of the individual are arguably more important than the data on the heart rate monitor.
100%. The metrics are secondary to the physiological reality of the individual right in front of you.
So what should trainers be watching for visually?
Practitioners must constantly monitor for signs of poor perfusion or excessive cardiovascular strain. This means watching for syncope or dizziness.
Getting lightheaded after a set.
Right. Observing if there is dyspnea, shortness of breath, that doesn't resolve during the rest periods. And paying close attention to subjective reports of extreme, disproportionate fatigue.
Like they just hit a sudden wall.
Exactly. And it should go without saying, any presentation of angina or unusual chest discomfort is an immediate cessation of activity, period.
Right. No pushing through chest pain.
Never. But when those symptoms are absent and the autonomic recovery remains sharp, practitioners need to recognize that a delayed heart rate climb is completely normal.
It completely dismantles the cultural narrative that aging inherently equals systemic breakdown.
It really does.
We operate under this assumption that if an 85-year-old's physiological response doesn't perfectly mirror a 55-year-old's response, the older system must be failing or fragile.
But it's just different.
Exactly. What Troy Teixeira's observations highlight is that the lack of an early heart rate spike isn't a glitch. The aging cardiovascular system has intelligently shifted its mechanics to rely on stroke volume and peripheral resistance early on.
It's pacing its neuroendocrine response.
Right, and preserving its chronotropic reserves for when they are absolutely biologically necessary. It isn't a weaker heart. It is a highly evolved, deeply efficient system managing resources under load.
It is a masterclass in biological conservation. And understanding this reliance on alternative hemodynamic strategies early in exertion, this raises an important question for you to consider.
Okay, what's that?
If we know that the aging cardiovascular system shifts away from rapid chronotropic responses and instead relies heavily on increasing blood pressure and stroke volume while navigating stiffer arteries and delayed sympathetic activation,
Yeah.
how should that fundamentally alter the protocol for warm-ups in older populations?
Oh, wow.
Right. If their system requires a slow, gradual accumulation of stress to dilate vessels and elevate catecholamines, do we need to abandon short, dynamic warm-ups?
Just jumping right into it.
Exactly. Should we abandon those in favor of prolonged, low-intensity, continuous work to safely prime that less reactive system before introducing heavy mechanical loads?
That is a phenomenal programming consideration. If the system's architecture literally requires 20 minutes just to initiate sympathetic drive and adjust to fluid shifts, rushing them under a heavy barbell in minute 5 is working entirely against their physiological pacing.
You're forcing a gear shift that isn't ready.
It demands a complete reevaluation of how we prepare the aging body for stress. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration into the hemodynamics, the compounding physiological factors, and the remarkable autonomic flexibility of the aging cardiovascular system has provided you with a much deeper understanding of how our bodies adapt over time.
It's pretty amazing stuff.
Truly. Take these insights, apply them to your own training methodologies, and we will catch you next time.